Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to quickly go over how to create an effect something like this. So my concept here is obviously it's some kind of blade stripping wallpaper off a wall. And you can see it's following a curved path and we've got the wallpaper appearing to strip off and flop down as it travels along. What this is really all about is the use of curves and parenting and constraints. So to begin with, let's just set up the scene. So I'm going to add a simple plane. I could use the images as planes add-on, but for this effect I'll just do it in a very simple way. So I'm going to rotate on the X 90, we'll scale that up a little bit and then go into edit mode, press U and say project from view bounds. Next we'll go to shading, we'll go to materials and say new. I'm not going to worry too much about materials in this, although there is a little bit of something that we need to do in it. But to begin with, I'm just now going to add an image texture, which is just this simple wallpaper texture. And I'll accept the defaults on that for the moment. We will be revisiting this material setup shortly. I'm in the default Eevee render at the moment, and it's up to you what kind of renderer you want to use. But what we can do is select perhaps some alternatives in here to give us some different lighting depending on what you want. So back to layout, we'll call this material wallpaper and we'll go to material view there. So first of all we want to define where our wallpaper stripper is going to go. So I'm going to add a simple path. There it is. If I go into edit mode I can see what direction it's going, although it's possible to reverse that anyway. So I can see I want to rotate it that way. Rotate Y 90. So we can now see our little path is just coming from top to bottom. So if you just wanted a straight path, that's all you need to do. I decided to use a slightly more interesting path. In edit mode, just grab the last point, drag that somewhere down there. Grab another point, perhaps move that over to there. And another one perhaps over to there. You don't necessarily want extreme movements. And what I also did, I've selected them all there, is right click and say subdivide. And then that will give you opportunities to sort of force it to go where you want it to go, but not have too extreme a change in direction. So I'm just pressing G to move these. So there's our initial path. We'll call that strip path and we'll call the plane wall. You can see it's put it in the default collection up there. So let's move that close to the wall. And now we need to make our stripper, so to speak. So I've just moved the cursor and I'm going to add a simple cube, scale that down and then scale it on the X and then scale it down a bit further. Zoom in on that and that will be our blade. We'll give that a new material. We'll call that steel. We'll make the base color basically grey and we'll make it very metallic. Just back that off very slightly and back off the roughness quite a long way as well. So we'll call that blade. I'm now going to add a plane, rotate X 90 and scale that plane down. I've added a loop into the center of that plane and now I'm just going to delete the corners. The reason I did it this way is so that the origin of this plane is in the middle, which helps when we do the mirror in a moment. So back into edit mode, select all the vertices and subdivide. I'll subdivide them a bit more there as well, just to make them square, just makes things easier. I'm going to delete that corner and I'm going to scale it in on the X. This is just a rough shape, it doesn't matter too much. I'm going to select those two, pressing O and then GX. And I'm just bringing this edge out. I'm going to use sharp fall off. So I'm only moving on the X. I think I'll use sphere, something like that. Just straightening those edges up. And now I'll extrude it, E and then Y, and we'll just take it that way a little bit, something like that. Go to face select mode and we'll remove these faces. And then we'll add a mirror modifier. We'll say clipping and we'll narrow the neck in a little bit there. So there's a rough approximation of a tool and we'll just give that a relatively simple material. I made mine a blue color and quite shiny. What I then did was select the handle Decided not to join them, but it's up to you what you do in that respect. Can make it a little easier if you don't. Select the handle, select the blade, Control P and say set parent to object. And now as the blade moves around, the handle will follow it. And now I'm just going to rotate the blade on the X axis just to tilt everything out slightly there, like that. Obviously you can put a bit more work into the blade to make it a more realistic blade. So that's our tool. And what we now want is for this to move along that path. So selecting the blade, let's move that over to about here, the starting point. And we want it to just impinge with the wall surface very slightly. And I'm just going to move that curve in slightly so it's about level. On the blade, I'm going to select constraints. I'm going to add an object constraint, which is a follow path constraint. The path is strip path, which is this. Now, typically it'll go flying off into the distance there initially. And you can try a few of these options here to see what brings it back. Now, if I press play initially, nothing is going to happen. And that's because this path isn't animated yet. There's possibly a little bit of a bug with automatically animating. I tried this and it animated to 100 frames, which is the default, but then I was unable, even when changing the settings of the curve, to get it to animate 250. I had to redo the curve animation. So I suggest just go straight to the curve at this point, go to curve properties, under path animation, change the number of frames to the number you want to animate over, and in this case I'm just going to use the default of 250. Then go back to your blade constraints and say animate path. At the moment it's not moving, so if we try some of the other options, so we can see there that it is moving, but we just need to deal with that slight offset. And you can see, because I set it manually, it is taking the full 250 frames to travel that whole path. So you can just accept the default. I need to bring that offset back, just bring that blade back in, rotate Y 90, GZ just to bring it down to where I wanted it to start, and then rotate X to about the sort of angle that I wanted. And if we now press play, we can see we've got our cutter cutting along the path. However, it's not doing it quite as you might expect, and the reason for that is we need to just change one of the settings in here. So if we say follow curve, and we just need to tweak it again now, and now press play, you can see it now rotates as you would expect it to as it runs along the curve. So there's our cutter animation. And the next thing we need to do is to make the wall appear to lose its wallpaper at that point. So before we go any further, let's just make sure that the cutter is actually contacting with the wall. It's not quite doing so at the moment, and this will become clear as to why it's important in a moment. So I'm just going to move it in with GY just so that it does touch the wall. And now we can see it's mostly poking through the wall. Perhaps I'll push it in a little further. It shouldn't matter too much because there's things we can do about that, but there it is. So we've got our cutter impinging on the wall. So now I'm going to select the wall and I'm going to come to physics properties and I'm going to select dynamic paint. And I'm going to say add canvas. What we're going to do is paint our path on the wall with this blade. Under format, you could use vertices, but in order to get a smooth path, you'd need an awful lot of vertices. So there's a much better way of doing that, and that's to select image sequence. I used a resolution of 1024. The higher the resolution, the smoother the edges will be. And exactly how high it needs to be obviously depends on how close the camera is. And I used the anti-aliasing option just to help smooth it out. We need to make the frame start wherever we need to start stripping wallpaper and the end wherever it needs to end. In the case of this tutorial, it's 1 to 250. If you're going very, very quickly, you may need sub-steps. I didn't have a need for that, and generally you won't. We don't need dry. This is an effect if it's sort of water staining something and then the water drying off, so we don't need that effect. And then under output, it will have a default location for its dynamic paint map. That's fine. Make sure it's using the UV map you created for the wall and determine what format you want to use. I left it as PNG, which is the default, and paint maps. So before we bake the image sequence, we now need to set the brush. So select the blade, then again under physics, under dynamic paint, click that and set this to brush and add brush. Set the paint color to whatever you want. I set mine to white. The reason for that is because it makes it easier and clearer for one of the later steps where we're trying to differentiate between what areas have been painted and what haven't. For source, rather than just the mesh volume, so the volume occupied by the blade, I set mesh volume and proximity. So that means if the blade does come away from the wall very slightly occasionally, it doesn't matter, it will still affect it and cause it to effectively be stripped of wallpaper. But I made it a very narrow distance, so 0.1 is what I put in there. You can play with the fall off, I left it as smooth, and then you can go back to your wall and you can bake the image sequence. So having done that, even if we press play, we can't currently see any difference. And the reason for that is because we need to now incorporate our paint map that we just created. So rather than using the shading option up here, I'm now going to select shader up here because I need plenty of screen area for this. And I'm just going to duplicate that image node and we're going to open here. And you can see we've got a folder called Cache Dynamic Paint. You could of course define this so that it's a specific one. And you can see we've got a whole load of images in here which we just created. There's actually more than we just created in here because it's also got the ones from a previous run that I did. So we only need the first 250. So I'll select the first one. It should already have detect sequences written and say open image. Change this to image sequence. Enter into here the number of frames, so in this case 250, and the start frame. And if you wanted to start somewhere other than frame 1, you'd put that in here. So if I put this into the input here now, I'm going to drag a new window down, and we'll change this back to the 3D view, and then I'll just press play. Now initially when you do this, you press play and it doesn't seem to update properly. If you click on auto refresh, go back to the beginning and press play, you can now see it's stripping properly. Now obviously for the scale of image I've got at the moment, the proximity I've got there is much too large because it's much larger than the blade itself. So I'll go back to my blade and under distance I'm going to go to 0.01 now and we'll rebake the image map. So let's have a look at that. And I had to reread the file in and reset the number of frames. And you can now see we're getting pretty much what we want. So it's just drawing our path onto the wall. So we now need to use that to decide whether we have wallpaper or wall. If I put my wallpaper back in, this is the image that makes the decision on what we have. I'm just going to run the blade a little way in so that we can see what we're doing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create another material node. This one I'm just going to give it a sort of blue color. I'm going to add a shader, which is a mix shader. Drop that in there. Put our blue material on the other one. Make this one a little less rough. And then I will use this one to decide which of the two materials is displayed. Now you can see that it's a bit transparent. So what we need to do is also add a converter, which is a color ramp. We'll set this to constant. And you can see once I've brought that node down a little bit, there is our wall showing through. So there, I'm just playing that now and you can see that's now stripping the wallpaper away nicely. At this point I'm just going to add a lamp or light, which is a sunlight. And I'm just going to go to Cycles Render and set that to quite a small angle so that we can get some good shadows. So I'm just going to add a little something extra in here. So we obviously want the wallpaper to have a certain thickness to it. So what I need to do is use this material here, this dynamic paint map, to create a bump. So I'm going to add a vector node, which is a bump node, and drop that in there, input it into the normal. I'm then going to take another of the outputs from, I know this is quite small at the moment, my color ramp output, into the height there. Now at the moment you can see where the shadow is, it's on the wrong side. But if I click invert, now you can see it's picking light up here and not here. We can probably do exactly the same on the other side. So that's just giving us a little bit of height there. And if we go over to here to our painted wall, and now we've got a shadow on that side. So I've just put the same node in, still inverted, into each of them. So that gives us a little shadow on that side and a little catch of light on that side. If you want to, you can play around by adding a slight blur to this node, then use a color ramp to catch that blur and perhaps put a sort of ripped paper texture. And that is what I did with mine. But for this exercise, I'm just going to leave it very simple like that. That's now stripping away our wallpaper. You can see it being stripped away nicely there. And you can see it's leaving a nice track there. So the final element is to have the strip of wallpaper coming off. This was a little trickier than I expected it to be, but once I got the hang of what I needed to do, it wasn't too bad. So I'm going to make a duplicate, first of all, of my wall. However, I'm also going to then go to materials on that piece of wall, and I'm going to click this little 2 to make the wallpaper unique. We'll just call it wallpaper 2. We'll go to shading, and we'll just take away all the complexity with this one. All we need is just the wallpaper. We don't need anything fancy with this one at all. So you can see it's just the wallpaper texture into the Principled shader and into the material output. Next, I'm just going to right click in edit mode, subdivide, and we'll subdivide a few times, perhaps 100. I want this wallpaper to be splittable, as it were, and I need this to be about the width of my blade there. So I'm just going to box select. I'm going to go around the middle because that way the origin is already roughly in the right place. It'll make it easier to move the thing around. And then come up to select, invert, and delete vertices. I think I need to make that slightly bigger, and now delete vertices. There we go. So let's have a look at that. Possibly too big. I'm really just comparing it to the size. So let's remove those vertices. And it doesn't matter too much, but I'm just going to take off these edges like that. So I've got a strip of wallpaper. Now, something I forgot until I'd already rendered it once was, of course, this strip of paper, as it comes off, this face will be facing downward, not upward, which is the way I had it initially. So just bear that in mind. Before I go any further, I need this to have a little bit of thickness because it needs to have 2 faces. It's going to have a face with the material on it and a face with, if you like, the blank wallpaper on it. So I'm going to come down to here and I'm going to say add a modifier, and it's a solidify modifier. I'm going to come down to materials now, and I'm going to add a new material, which is wallpaper back. And we'll just make that a just slightly yellow color. I added a simple bit of roughness to it as well, just to make it easier to see. But at the moment, it's not being used for anything other than the edges here. So let's go back to our modifier and maybe make this 0.005, or even thinner than that, 0.0025. So it's nice and thin. And then by setting the material offset here to 1, the new face that the solidify modifier has created is now set to the new material that I created. So I'm going to rotate X 90, and that's now that material on the top, which is where I want it. So just going to position that roughly where I need it to start, and we'll go back to this mode now as it's a bit easier to see what's going on. So the first thing we need to know is how do we control the angle of this paper strip, because obviously it needs to match the angle of the blade. As the blade rotates, which it does as it moves along, that strip of paper needs to rotate as well. So to achieve that, we add a constraint, and the constraint is copy rotation. We tell it to use the blade. We'll have an offset to begin with, and we're only interested in this case in the Y rotation of the blade. So if we press play now, you can see it does rotate with the blade. It's the wrong way up at the moment, but we'll correct that in a moment. So we go into edit mode, select all the faces, rotate Y 180, and then come out of edit mode, and that's corrected the orientation. So you can now see the strip of wallpaper rotates along with the blade, which is just what we want. So now we want the wallpaper, as things progress, to push out as though it's being stripped off by the blade. So I'm going to create another curve path now. So curve path, rotate Z minus 90, just to have it coming out there like that. Look from above, and we'll just position that curve where it needs to be. So we'll put it here to start with. We'll go into edit mode. And the idea of this is the path that the strip of paper will follow relative to the blade as it's stripped away. So it doesn't need to be too complex. So something like that. It's going to come out and then flop down like that. Perhaps drop that one down a little bit, or maybe not. Maybe we'll have it pushing up. So that's up to you. We'll give that a name. We'll call that new strip path. So now go back to my plane, and I'm going to add, this time, another modifier. And this modifier is called curve. So I'll just minimize the others to avoid confusion. And I'm going to use the new curve that I just created. And the idea is, as I move this mesh in the y-axis, it now follows that curve, as you can see. So I'm just going to push that up to be roughly where it needs to be. And that all seems to be okay. And what I now need is for this strip of paper to just move along this path and also to always be connected to the blade. Now I've tried many times parenting it directly to the blade, and I just couldn't get everything to work because the blade had other rotations on it which were causing complications. However, the solution I found was to add an empty. So I'm adding an empty plain axis here, and I'm just going to put it here. It doesn't have to be here, I think, but nevertheless this helps. So I put the empty just there, and I'm going to add a constraint to the empty. So we come to constraints, add an object constraint, and it's copy location. So it's not parented, but it's going to be linked to the blade. So we'll click blade here, and I've got it set to X, Y, and Z. So if I press play now, you can see the empty travels around with the blade. It doesn't rotate, it just follows the X and Y and Z as it happens location of the blade. Then I'm going to select my strip of wallpaper here, select that empty, Control P, and say object. And now you can see as I press play, so we've got the wallpaper coming through a little bit, but what we really need to do now is just animate that wallpaper. I also need to parent my curve to the empty because that needs to be aligned with the wallpaper as well. So Control P and say object. And now when I press play, they're just all moving together. But obviously at the moment the wallpaper is not coming out with the blade. So there's one last thing we need to do. We select our wallpaper strip, we make sure we're at the beginning of the animation, we press I and record the location. We go to the end of the animation, we press G, Y, and we push our wallpaper strip, in this case just past the end because we've dropped off the bottom of the wall. And you may need to play with this just to get the right amount of wallpaper strip. With the severity of curve that I've done, I probably need a much longer strip than this, but it gives you the general idea. I'm going to press I and say location again. And the other thing before we go any further is I'm going to bring up the graph editor and just go to key interpolation mode and say linear, because obviously the wallpaper is going to come out at the same speed all the way across if our blade is moving at a constant speed, which for our purposes it is. And now when I press play, you can see the wallpaper starts to come out with our blade. And if you want to be very finicky, what you can do is try to align the material on our wallpaper with what's being stripped off the wall. Generally speaking, it's not going to be that noticeable. And that's all there is to creating a strip coming off a wall. And I'm sure you can come up with many other applications for this technique. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well, and I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.